Hi there. Today I want to talk about the Shampeachment witnesses and why I was singularly unimpressed by them. And this is based on my own experiences that I had at the Pentagon when I served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Command, Control, and Communications in the first Clinton administration. I learned, well, there are a lot of my experiences that I could bring to bear in talking about this issue, but let's just talk about some of the witnesses. So there was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense on the Wednesday, Laura Cooper. I don't really have anything to say about her. I didn't really watch all the hearings. There was a Deputy Assistant Secretary, George Kent, the guy with the bow tie. And there were others. But the reason I say that is because I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. I got hired. Yes, you get hired. I had served in the Clinton campaign, the Clinton-Gore campaign in Little Rock, Arkansas. I'll also have a lot of stories about that bear on the situation. But after the president won the election, let me tell you, there is a major, major scramble that goes on in terms of people trying to get positions. And it was a little difficult for me because I wanted a policy position, and a lot of the people that I worked with went straight to the White House. But a policy position in one of the departments, that comes a little bit later. So when I eventually interviewed with Bill Perry, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time under Les Aspin, he took over after Les Aspin stepped down. But he was kind of, I guess, tasked with hiring the people on the sort of technical side of the house, whereas Les Aspin interviewed and hired the people on the policy side of the house, which I guess a lot of these people, like this Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukrainian, and Eurasian Affairs, she's part of the policy side. So I can't really speak to that, but I can speak to some of the others. So what happened was I was hired as what was called Senior Executive Service 6, which is the highest level you could get. After that, you're like an assistant secretary. You're something different. But all of my colleagues, you could say, at that same level, they were all career civil servants. So I kind of brought something new to the table. And I remember thinking at the time, as I worked at the Pentagon for a little over 2.5 years before I came back home, I remember thinking that it's really valuable to have someone from the outside come in, because people just do things the same way and nobody questions it. And I am, I am constitutionally unable not to question things. Now, when I interviewed with Bill Perry, I had a strategy. So I had read up on Bill Perry. I knew his views on a lot of things. And it was funny because I was working at RAND at the time. And I talked to one of the vice presidents there and said, "Do you have any suggestions?" And he said, "Well, it's always good to, don't be too agreeable. Disagree with something." And so I did, which I did disagree with something. And that's another story. But one of my main goals in taking this position, my overall theme was, I worked a lot in the communications industry. I had worked at RAND, but I had been a satellite systems engineer. I was also married to the father of the geostationary satellite, the late great Harold Rosen. And so I just knew a lot about those issues and really how far the military procurement process, particularly at that time, had gone wrong, both in computers and communications. Because one of the things is things were happening so fast in the commercial world, technologies were improving, but the military acquisition system was very slow, because people would write these requirements that they shouldn't be writing. So I was a big proponent of what would be called functional specifications, rather than saying how something should be done, because you don't know what industry or someone else can come up with to solve that problem. The functional specifications allow you to say, okay, I want something that can, I don't know, do this or do that. But don't tell them in the military procurement system, as they were doing then, how to do it. I mean, for computers, they would even have specifications for clock speed. I mean, it was crazy. So anyway, I had a really great conversation with Bill Perry, and you could tell we were hitting it off. So I waited until that had happened. And then I said, I do have one potential problem. And he said, well, what is that? And I said, my husband's in the aerospace industry, because Harold was a big VP at Hughes Aircraft Company at the time. But Harold had told me he had met Bill Perry some time ago, and Bill Perry really liked Harold or admired him. So I said, my husband's an executive at Hughes Aircraft Company. And he says, oh, really? Who? And I said, Harold Rosen. And he said, you're married to Harold Rosen? And it was a love fest from that point on. Meanwhile, John Deutsch was sitting in the corner just kind of glaring. He turned out to be difficult for me later, but I didn't pay attention to him. I didn't think of that. Innocent soul that I was. But anyway, so, I mean, even to get that interview, after the campaign left, everybody's calling up everybody else. You know, what should I do? Well, maybe if you send in, resumes or letters of recommendation. Believe it or not, I got a recommendation from George Fisher, who was I had met him at some campaign event. He was the CEO and president and CEO, chairman and CEO of Motorola. I got a letter of recommendation from Dianne Feinstein, and there was somebody else, and I'm sorry, I just can't, I have to look through my notes and figure out who that was. But anyway, you're calling, it's a very, let me tell you, it's a very stressful time. And I only mention this because I just almost had to laugh when, okay, I'm looking at my notes here. Former Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, not sure if she's going to stay with Trump because, is he going to fire her? The Democrats made a big, how did you feel? I mean, it was laughable in every new administration. And you can go back to Obama, Reagan, I mean, all of them. They fire everybody. Most of the time they just fire everybody. Now, for some reason, Trump didn't do that. He didn't kind of fire everybody. Maybe he wanted to get the lay of the land. He left people in place, and then slowly he started firing them. But I'm sorry, that's just the way Washington works. So that was absolutely laughable. I kid you not, absolutely laughable. But here was the thing. When I became the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, we called them DASDs, for C3, Command, Control, and Communications, I reported to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for C3I, that's intelligence. But there were I wouldn't say a lot, there were I think 4 other or 5 other DASDs that also reported to the for the Assistant Secretary of Defense. And they were all career civil servants. So when I listened to in the impeachment hearings, people like Deputy Assistant Secretary George Gant and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, these are all career civil servants. I mean, nobody, I just imagine these people that were my colleagues. What does President Trump want? They're all talking. Because when a new administration comes in, It's kind of interesting. Like, I had a lot of, how should I say, power, because I had worked on that. I didn't really interact with Bill Clinton. I mean, he knew my name. He'd always say, "Hi, Deborah," and say something nice. I think that happened to me over 12 times. But I never actually had a conversation with him. I had lots of conversations with people who then had conversations. So like one of the persons I kind of reported to on the campaign was George Stephanopoulos. And he was the one that actually first called me when I was at RAND and asked me to be part of their foreign policy team. And that's kind of how I got started. So anyway, it was laughable to think that these career civil servants have any idea. So when they were talking about how they're calling this person, they're calling that person, and they're trying to figure out, I mean, these are not high-level people. I mean, they're high level to a certain extent. So for example, the protocol equivalent of my job, I was a 3.5-star general. And as a former airman in the Air Force, that was like a thrill. So that, now what does that mean, protocol equivalent? You do that for seating arrangements. So for example, if I would go visit a SINC, which is Commander-in-Chief of one of the commands, they'd be a 4-star general. So even though there's civilian control of the military, and they all knew that, there was the seating arrangement, the SINC, the 4-star, would sit at the head of the table. But if there's 3 stars, and that's mostly who I dealt with, were 3 stars, like vice admirals and lieutenant generals, I technically outranked them in the protocol area. But I always kind of, how do I say, outranked them in terms of being part of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which was out on the 3rd floor. I had a great office. I mean, it was like awesome. You could see my window, my 3 windows. I would say, those are my windows, right? It was a very high-level position, and frankly, I loved it. I loved all these people calling me ma'am and treating me with great respect. but I really had a mission, and I fought a lot. Okay, so here was the other thing that I so identified with. And I'm going to take a slight detour here, because one of the things that I'm actually enjoying about these videos, because after my first few months at the Pentagon, the information overload was tremendous, tremendous. So I started writing everything down. So what would happen is you'd have a calendar that was public. I mean, yeah, it was kind of public about who you were meeting with and when. And I would make a copy of that every day. It was like my thing I had to do at night after I do all my signature stuff where I have to sign all these papers. I would write down who I met with, what their name was, and I kept it. And then I would also at the top write kind of almost in a journal-like way, like, man, I was really stressed today, or I should have gotten more sleep, I really miss Harold, you know, whatever. I would write down how I felt, or like I'm feeling really good. So I spent some time this week, and even on Christmas Day, because I decided not to travel, go anywhere. So I was answering texts from family members and friends, and I was reading about 1995, sort of my tail end of my days at the Pentagon. And boy, I mean, I don't even know how I did it. I took on a lot of issues. And that's one of the things. Okay, another detour briefly. I tried to figure out, what is it about President Trump? I mean, I love his policies. I absolutely love his policies. I love what he's trying to do. I hate that he's attacked so much, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it also, I'm kind of the same personality in a way, except I could not do what he does. So I really admire him. I mean, how he keeps going, how this doesn't bring him down, because I'm basically at heart a little bit of a hermit. I mean, I live in this beautiful, beautiful home that my husband's first wife picked out, and she died in 1969 of cancer. So he had been single for 15 years before he met me, but she picked this house out. That's what Harold told me, and I always thank her. Thank you, Rosetta, for picking out this beautiful home, which I now live in. I mean, life is really, really interesting and kind of wonderful. I'm very blessed. Boy, I'm really going over the map here. Okay, so I actually have not reviewed these notes and this information since I wrote it 25 years ago. You know, because you think, wow, this is really important information. I mean, I used to think when I was younger, I'm going to do something great in my life, and somebody's going to write a biography about me, so I better record everything. I mean, it's kind of laughable to me now, but I do have a well-recorded life. It's sort of funny, but I'm really glad I did it. And I looked some people up, friends, foes, and read their obituaries. And I'll talk about some of the people, because one of my strategies has been, I'm really good judge of people who are good at something. And I was talking to my stepson, Robert, and I told him, you know, Harold was like that. He was really good at knowing who was good and who wasn't. And I'm the same way. That's been kind of, because I've gone into, oh man, I'm going all over the map here. Anyway, I've gone into many different new situations where I didn't have a clue how to operate, but I could usually figure out who are the really smart people and who could help me and who's on my side, if you will. So I pick allies, I pick people whose brains I could pick, and really that's how I survived, I think, in doing all these things. So, about the witnesses. As we know from whatever parts of this impeachment we listened to, really none of them had ever directly talked to President Trump. They were all supposing certain things, and they were all talking and whatever. Oh, I'm so sorry. I've got to say something about Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. Oh, he might have done something in Afghanistan or whatever. But what a pompous ASS. And he felt a little like a traitor to me. And I think he's the one that fed the information. I mean, the interaction between him and Schiff told me that he's the leaker. He's the one. But he walks out there with his uniform. I'm thinking, you're not even a full bird colonel. You're just a lieutenant colonel. Do you know how many lieutenant colonels? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to denigrate, because the people out in the field who are lieutenant colonels are actually pretty cool. But the ones at the Pentagon and in Washington, it's like, that is a very low level position for that. Really, seriously, lieutenant colonel. I mean, I remember bragging to my friends when I was in the Air Force, because I used the men's restroom, because the women's restroom was when I was on TDY, temporary duty. And so I went in the men's restroom, and this full bird colonel came in, and he's like looking at me, and I thought, well, if he's not bothered, I'm washing my hands, I'm not bothered. I mean, they had stalls. What difference does it make? And then he started yelling at me, little airman, Castleman, So I went back and told all of my friends, other airmen, it's like, I got yelled at by a full bird colonel. And they were impressed. And I was impressed. So anyway, I mean, you have to remember, President Trump is the commander-in-chief. He is their absolute boss, okay? And in the military, it's very much a hierarchical situation, very much. You mean there are protocol for you have to use the chain of command. I mean, this is just drilled into you. The only time you can not use a chain of command, you have to use the chain of command first. I had this experience when I was in the Air Force. And if it doesn't work doing the chain of command and you think something is really wrong, then you go to the IG, the Inspector General. And I did that once, and that's another story. I have all kinds of stories. Okay, so I have to just give you in little driblets. So anyway, the thought that he's listening in, that's an honor, that you get to listen in to the president's conversations to another world leader, and then he runs off and he tells that other kid, and then they go talk to Schiff and coordinate with him. I mean, it is disgusting, absolutely disgusting. And I hope that what they end up doing is get all those people off those calls. Why do they have to be on those calls? I mean, Trump will outsmart him. He'll figure that out. You know, another thing he did? Okay, now I'm really jumping around. But this, if you like my type of jumping around, I was thinking about, remember when Sarah Sanders Huckabee, we used to have the press conferences? And that Jim Costa would stand up and showboat and ask all these questions. And so Trump first tried, let me just ban him from the White House. And he got all kinds of blowback for that. So what does Trump do now? He just quit doing it. He just quit having those press conferences. Instead, he will answer questions when he has a foreign leader next to him. He's in the White House or he's meeting with people. He'll take a few questions from the press. Or he'll talk to them when he is going out to the helicopter. And you notice the camera is never on the reporters. You don't even know who's asking the question. It's just, Mr. President, but the cameras don't turn to them. So that's how he outsmarted him. And yet he's giving these press conferences all the time, but they're done on his terms. So Trump is really smart. And let me tell you, just from my own experience, I got a lot better at handling the bureaucracy and learning what to do and what not to do in my 2.5 years at the Pentagon. Towards the end. Because when you first go in, you know, I came from Rand, you know, I'm spouting off my opinions and whatever. But I found I could not spout off my opinions because people would think it's policy, given the level. So one time I said, yeah, I'd like to know more about da-da-da-da-da. And the next morning, there's like this report on my desk, you know, really nicely done. And some lieutenant colonel or whatever had stayed up all night writing this report for me just because I expressed an interest in knowing more about it. And I was horrified. Oh my God, I didn't mean for the poor guy. So I started to try to be more careful about things that I said or opinions that I expressed. I realized you can't just freely express your opinion. Although President Trump does. I mean, he is, because one of the things Washington teaches you is you've got to be so careful how you phrase things. So careful. So I was particularly, and here's another thing. So I would give speeches, I would go, I loved getting out of the Pentagon. Even the Pentagon was fun, but going out to different sites, I mean, I went on nuclear submarines. I was in charge of a nuclear war on a plane when I was going to visit Strategic Air Command. That was tough, but I was good because I know nuclear command and control. Sometime I'll tell you that story. But I was particularly struck about EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland. So here's what I think happened with him, because he was sort of a Trump supporter. So, and I want to thank, I don't know him, Tucker Carlson, because he pointed out that all 4 of Sondland's lawyers were Democratic donors. So I guess he had lawyers, and like the main one, or the one that was sitting next to him, had given over $130,000 to Democrats over the years. And he had represented Stefan Halper during the Russian hoax. And then also, Tucker pointed out that Gordon Sondland and his family had been under intense pressure from the left. Like they were doing things with his business and home and harassing him. And anyway, I will try to, if I can figure out how to do this, I'm pretty sure I can, leave a link to the Tucker segment where he talks about this, because I found it enlightening. Now, Tucker Carlson, he was very careful. He said, it appears, and I can't say for sure, because you don't want to accuse somebody, especially on television, of something that they might not have done. But I'm a little freer here to speculate, and I'm speculating. Because one of the things I learned is your staff, that means people below you, because I had directorates below me, would always, like you're going to give a speech or something, they will write something up. Or you're going to give congressional testimony, they will write it up for you. And I could never just take it, because I look at it and go, I'm not presenting this, okay? So I would have to do a lot of work to try to fix it. So I gave congressional testimony a couple times. And that's so hard, because if you don't totally agree with the policy, you kind of want to get your stuff in there, but not. And I'm not saying I was going against the Clinton administration. It wasn't so much that, but things that people in the bureaucracy were pushing. But I managed. But anyway, so Jim Jordan and also, who was the other guy? Mike Turner did a great job in questioning Gordon Sondland, because he had this 23-page opening statement, and basically, and apparently on page 14 of this opening statement, I didn't listen to his opening statement, I'm hearing it after the fact. He said very clearly, so yes, there was a quid pro quo. So when these two representatives, firebrands, God, I love these guys, question him, Gordon Sondland walked it all back. And he said, and so Jim Jordan kept saying, why didn't you put this in the speech? You know, you couldn't put it in the speech? You know, he had some flaky answer, I guess, that, you know. But anyway, he said, it wasn't purposeful, trust me, you know. And he made all these statements where his opening statement did not go along with his responses to questions. So I'm thinking, his staff, and now that once I heard from Tucker Carlson who this staff was, these 4 Democratic lawyers had written his opening statement. So I get that. He was a busy guy, you know, whatever. But this was so important that he allowed them to write it. And he clearly didn't think through the implications of what he was saying. I mean, what is he, low IQ? What's up with that? I mean, it's like, wasn't he paying attention? Didn't he know he would be used? I mean, it was just, so if you listen to the segment, go back and listen to it. Look at his face. First of all, he has what we used to call a SHIT eating grin, but it was like he was caught. And he tried to make light. So when Jim Jordan says, so who was at this hypothetical meeting? I mean, this meeting that ever happened. And he laughed. He laughed at Jim Jordan's joke. And I'm thinking, what? You don't even realize the seriousness of what you're doing and how you're being used by the Democrats. Because it was either Jim Jordan or Mike Turner pointed out to him, I think it was Jim Jordan, you know that when you made that statement, Adam Schiff went right out and CNN and all these places were running it. There was a quid pro quo. So, it was like, are you, anyway. It's fascinating. So I'll leave you some, I think I can do like a comment or something right below the video where I can give you a link, because I spent some time looking for that Tucker Carlson insight. And also, just watch that guy's face. I mean, that was what was happening. So these people were, in short, these people were not at all anybody that should be testifying against President Trump. That's all I can say about that. So, since I'm doing these weekly, let me just say one small thing about Pete Buttigieg and his recent statement about decriminalizing all drug use. Now, I thought about that. I thought, he's not really a good politician, or he doesn't really understand how this works. Because if you're going to run for president, it's best to be defined by a few key things. What are your issues? I mean, I think he thinks that's a good idea. So when the question was asked, he could have phrased it, that's something I think we should look into. And I hope we can eventually move in that direction. That would be okay. But now this could become, I'm not saying it will, but it could become his signature issue. And I don't even know if he's thought that through as a signature issue. And the reason I say that is when I worked on the Clinton campaign, they were very disciplined. So it was actually kind of fun because we were in small rooms. I kind of had 3 bosses that I answered to. Which meant I really didn't answer to anybody. I was on the issue staff. And so I was in this room, with the glass windows, so you could see the other room. And in that other room, there was just like a little whiteboard, a chalkboard. I think it was a whiteboard, where James Carville had written, "It's the economy, stupid." That's all, and like with a marker. It wasn't like an official sign. But one of the things that was stressed was that every day, all they wanted Governor Clinton, that's what he's called at the time, Governor Clinton to do was talk about the economy, and secondly, he could talk about healthcare, and that was it. So, you have all these other people saying, "Oh, let's do this issue and that issue and this issue." So every night, at the end of the day, they would look at the 3 major networks, because that was what was operating then, and to see what was their clip about Governor Clinton. And if it was about the economy, or it could be about healthcare, but the economy, nothing else, it was like cheers in the room. We did it. I mean, it was very disciplined. And so that's what James Carville meant about it's the economy, stupid. It means don't get sidetracked. This is how we're going to win. So that's what that was about. So is Pete Buttigieg going to be, I'm about decriminalization? Because they'll talk about that. Has he really thought this through? What did Trump do when he was running? I mean, it was really about build the wall, about make America great again. I mean, he kept to a few simple but strong themes. And that works because people, you don't want to be like a policy wonk where you have all of these things. So anyway, that's sort of the news of the week. And I love it. A couple of you said, "Oh, talk as long as you want." But I do think it's best if I try to keep this approximately the same time. And also I want to thank all of you. Oh, gosh. This is really great for me. This is fun. Because all week long I'm thinking about, I could talk about that. Oh, I could talk about that. I mean, I still have a ton of stuff I could talk about. And also, I have wanted to review some of the things that happened to me in the past. And because, of course, it informs how I feel now. I didn't talk about why my own experiences. Well, let me just say that when I would try to make changes, what I found at the Pentagon was I would get people who would super support me, okay? Like, oh, I love that you're doing this. Somebody's got to do it. Great, great, great. But there was always the others that didn't. It's a kind of a polarizing thing when that happens. And I don't really mind that too much, especially if I think I'm right. But President Trump will do that. Anytime you try to make changes, especially good changes, you're going to have a lot of people that try to fight you. So you just got to be smart about it. And our president is smart. So